Lily and Mark had just returned from the honeymoon of their dreams. It had been a week of joy, love, and laughter. The couple, married just a few months earlier, were the epitome of young love. They were adored by everyone who knew them, their relationship an inspiration to friends and family. They had just spent a romantic getaway, traveling across the beaches of the Caribbean, enjoying the beginning of their new life together. Their return to the small town where they had grown up was highly anticipated. Their friends planned a welcome-back party at their home. Family members, neighbors, and acquaintances were all excited to catch up with the couple. Everyone gathered at Lily and Mark's house, eagerly waiting to hear about their adventures and the highlights of their honeymoon. But as the clock ticked past noon on the day of their return, something felt off. A few people began to wonder why they hadn't heard from the couple. Maybe they're running late, some shrugged, but as the afternoon hours passed, the excitement turned into nervousness. By 3 p.m., people were calling their phones, but neither Lily nor Mark answered. One of the couple's closest friends, Sam, drove over to their house to check on them. The house was quiet. Lily's car was parked in the driveway, the engine still warm, but there was no sign of the couple. It wasn't like them to go out without letting anyone know, especially after being gone for a week. Sam peered into the house through the window and noticed something unusual. The door was wide open, and Mark's wedding ring was lying on the porch. No one had seen them leave the house, and the place was strangely still. With a sinking feeling, Sam called the police. The scene that unfolded was every family's worst nightmare. The car's open door, the abandoned wedding ring, and no sign of life anywhere. The police were called, but they found nothing unusual inside the house except a few signs of a hasty departure. There was no indication of a robbery or forced entry, and nothing seemed out of place, except for a deep feeling of dread in the air. No one knew where Lily and Mark had gone. Had they been kidnapped? Or was something more sinister at play? The first few days of the search were filled with confusion. The local police brought in dogs to search the nearby woods, the dense forest surrounding the town, where Mark and Lily had often walked during their courtship. But there was no trace of them. A few days turned into a week, and with no leads, the small town began to panic. Lily's parents, devastated and worried sick, spoke to reporters, asking anyone with information to come forward. "Please, if you've seen anything at all, please call the police," Lily's father begged, his voice trembling. The entire town rallied together to search for the couple. Posters were put up, and the media coverage intensified. Though the police had no suspects, they were clear on one thing: the couple hadn't disappeared on their own accord. The scene where Mark's wedding ring had been found seemed to imply something violent had taken place. It was as though they had been interrupted during something routine, like they had been forced to leave in a hurry. But no one could explain what had happened. Then, a breakthrough. A local mailman named Frank came forward with a key piece of information. Frank had seen Mark that morning, just hours before the couple went missing. He described Mark as walking toward the woods, wearing an unusual, grim expression. His gait was slow, almost as if he were weighed down with guilt or fear. The mailman said Mark looked around nervously before disappearing into the trees. This was the first lead. It sent the investigation into a new direction. The police were now certain that Mark knew more than he had let on. The police began to dig into Mark's past, searching for clues that might explain why he would vanish with his wife. They interviewed Mark's childhood friends, his old teachers, and even distant relatives. What they uncovered was surprising. Mark had been a model citizen for most of his adult life, but his teenage years had been a different story. Mark was no stranger to trouble. As a teenager, he had been arrested for a series of violent outbursts. In high school, there had been an incident where Mark had seriously injured another student during an argument. He had claimed it was self-defense, but rumors had circulated that it was a more deliberate attack. Mark had quickly left that part of his life behind when he met Lily, or so everyone thought. But the people who had known Mark back then painted a darker picture of his past. He had always struggled with controlling his emotions. While Mark had kept his troubled past hidden, the friends and family closest to him noticed the signs of an underlying issue. He was extremely possessive of Lily, often checking her phone, questioning her whereabouts, and always needing to know what she was doing at all times. But no one ever thought it was serious. They chalked it up to the typical insecurities of a newlywed. It was clear now that Mark's jealousy and insecurities ran far deeper than anyone could have imagined. The police uncovered journals and letters Mark had written, where he confessed that he was terrified Lily would leave him. He wrote obsessively about their relationship, tracking her every move, and even noting her conversations. Mark's obsession had been slowly building, and it seemed that something had triggered him to take drastic, violent action. With the new evidence about Mark's emotional instability, the police intensified their search, focusing on the areas Mark had frequented. They combed through the woods, searching for any trace of Lily's body. Meanwhile, neighbors and friends gave more insight into Mark's behavior. They revealed that there had been an ongoing tension in their relationship for months. Mark had often hinted at his fears of Lily leaving him, even before their wedding. But despite the new leads, there was still no physical evidence of the couple's whereabouts. That was until a call came in that changed everything. An anonymous tip led the police to an abandoned house outside of town. Inside, they found an eerie collection of personal items that had once belonged to Lily, photos, letters, and mementos from their life together. But what caught the police's attention the most were the strange tools scattered throughout the house. Ropes, zip ties, and duct tape. It became clear that Mark had been planning something for a long time. The room was littered with objects that suggested he had been preparing for the unthinkable. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was a cold, calculated plan. As the police looked deeper into the history of the abandoned house, they found it was owned by a man who had been out of town for years. There was no clear connection between the house and the couple, but the items found inside made it clear that this place had been used for something sinister. The breakthrough came when Mark was finally apprehended. It had been nearly 2 weeks since he disappeared. He was found hiding out in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. When the police arrived, Mark didn't resist. In fact, he looked almost relieved. He was exhausted, disheveled, and his eyes were hollow, as though he hadn't slept in days. Mark was interrogated, and after hours of questioning, he finally broke down and confessed. His words sent a shockwave through the entire town. "I did it," Mark said, his voice cold, almost emotionless. "I didn't want her to leave. I couldn't let her go." His confession was brutal and chilling. Mark explained that the night he killed Lily, they had argued in the woods. It started as a small fight over something trivial, but it quickly escalated. In a fit of rage, he attacked her, strangling her with his bare hands. "I didn't want her to hate me," Mark said, his eyes empty. "I wanted to make sure she would stay with me, forever, but she fought me, and I lost control." Mark's confession stunned everyone. A man who had been so well-liked, someone who had seemed to have everything, was revealed to be capable of the most horrific act imaginable. The police were left in shock as they pieced together the details of what had happened in those woods. The news of the murder spread like wildfire. The town, once so peaceful and close-knit, was shattered. People who had known Mark and Lily for years were devastated. They couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that Mark, a man they had trusted, had killed his wife. Local interviews with residents and friends were filled with disbelief. "He was always so sweet," one of Lily's childhood friends said, tears streaming down her face. "He would do anything for her. I just don't understand how this happened." For Mark's family, the news was even more painful. His parents, who had always been proud of their son, were in complete shock. Mark's mother was inconsolable, repeating over and over, "He was a good boy. He would never do something like this." But no one knew the hidden side of Mark, the man who couldn't handle rejection, who couldn't deal with the pressure of his own insecurities. His deep need for control had driven him to do the unthinkable. In the wake of Lily's tragic death, the grief was overwhelming. Lily's parents, heartbroken, spoke to the media, urging people to understand the depth of their pain. They described their daughter as a bright, shining light. "She had so much life left to live," her mother said, her voice breaking. "It's all gone now. She didn't deserve this." Friends of both Lily and Mark were devastated. No one could understand why it had happened. Lily had been the picture of happiness, always smiling, always the one to brighten up the room. It seemed impossible that the same man who had stood beside her on their wedding day was capable of taking her life. The funeral was a somber affair, with mourners flocking to say goodbye to a woman taken too soon. It was a day filled with sorrow, confusion, and anger. People who had known the couple looked at each other, trying to understand what had gone wrong. How could someone who seemed so perfect end up doing something so horrific? Mark was charged with first-degree murder. His trial was highly publicized, drawing attention from all over the country. The defense tried to argue that Mark had been suffering from temporary insanity, claiming that his obsession with Lily had pushed him over the edge. But the prosecution was relentless. They painted Mark as a cold, calculating killer who had planned everything from the beginning. The trial was intense. Lily's family testified about the kind of person she had been, a woman full of hope, dreams, and love. They spoke of the promise she had held and how Mark had betrayed that promise in the worst way possible. The trial culminated with a shocking revelation. Mark, sitting in the courtroom, looked at his wife's family and said, "I'm sorry for what I did. I didn't know how to stop, but I know now it was wrong." His apology did little to heal the pain he had caused, but it did bring a slight sense of closure to the family. After his conviction, Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to a high-security facility where he would spend the rest of his days. His life had been completely torn apart by his own actions. There were reports from prison that Mark often seemed lost in thought, staring at the walls, seemingly unaware of the world around him. It was clear that he regretted what he had done, but his regret seemed empty, as though he had only just begun to understand the enormity of his crime. The truth was, Mark had always struggled with his emotions. He had never known how to deal with his fears, his jealousy, or his need for control. Now, behind bars, Mark was left with nothing but the consequences of his actions. He had taken the life of the woman he had once loved, and there was no going back. The years following Lily's death were filled with healing for her family and friends. The town slowly started to move on, but the tragedy would never be forgotten. Lily's legacy lived on in the hearts of those who knew her. Her parents set up a foundation in her name to support women's rights and raise awareness about domestic violence. Mark's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most perfect-looking relationships can hide dangerous secrets. The tragedy served as a wake-up call for many, highlighting the importance of being vigilant and looking out for the signs of emotional abuse and control. The case also served as a reminder that no one is truly immune to the darker sides of human nature. Mark had been a loving husband to some, but to Lily, he was a man who had become consumed by his insecurities. As the years went on, the pain faded, but the lessons learned from Lily's life and death continued to shape the community. Her story, though tragic, became a symbol of hope, a reminder to always be aware of the hidden dangers in our lives. While Mark's conviction was final, there were still questions about how Lily's death had affected others in the community. Authorities continued to investigate the extent of Mark's past relationships, wondering if there had been other victims or signs that had been overlooked. Detectives re-interviewed people who had known Mark, looking for additional clues or red flags that might have been missed. They even found more disturbing evidence hidden in Mark's personal journals. There were stories of other women who had come and gone from Mark's life, each one described with a level of possessiveness and control that was chilling. But it seemed that Lily's death had been the tipping point. After her, Mark had no one left to manipulate. His actions had caught up with him in the most tragic way possible. Mark's days in prison were filled with isolation. His family, once so proud of him, had distanced themselves. They were ashamed, unable to face the reality of what he had become. He spent most of his time in solitary confinement, reflecting on his life and his actions. Some reports suggested that he found religion in prison, attempting to seek redemption for the murder of his wife. But others believed that he was just going through the motions, unable to fully accept responsibility for his crime. Mark's final days were quiet and uneventful. He had become a ghost of the man he once was, a broken soul who had destroyed the life of someone who had once loved him unconditionally. Though Lily's life was tragically cut short, her memory lived on. The foundation set up in her name continued to grow, helping women in need and supporting efforts to raise awareness about toxic relationships and emotional abuse. Lily's parents often spoke at public events, reminding people that no one should ever have to live in fear of someone they loved. Their mission was to make sure that Lily's death was not in vain. The foundation became a symbol of hope for many, and Lily's story inspired countless people to seek help when they were in dangerous relationships. Though Lily was gone, her spirit lived on in every life she touched. Mark spent his days in prison, alone with his thoughts. Some reports suggested that he regretted what he had done, but others believed that he still didn't fully grasp the depth of his actions. Inside his cell, Mark faced the reality of his choices. His life would never be the same. He would never get a chance to change the past. The tragedy of Lily and Mark's marriage served as a painful reminder that even the most perfect-looking relationships can hide dark secrets. The investigation revealed the importance of paying attention to warning signs, seeking help when needed, and recognizing that everyone has a story, even those we least suspect. This heartbreaking case left the world with one simple lesson: never take anything at face value. The truth can be far more disturbing than you ever imagine. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and stay updated.